students, welcome to my live teaching learning session of Principles of Microeconomics BECC, the last topic of this Principles of Microeconomics paper. International trade. What do you mean by international trade? International trade refers to exchange of goods and services between the people of two countries of the world. At present, all the economies are open economies. No one is closed. All countries have relationship with the rest of the world. And all countries do international trade. International trade is that trade which is done between the two countries or more than two countries. International trade means exchange of goods and services between the people of two countries of the world. And what is internal trade or domestic trade? Domestic trade or internal trade is that trade in which goods and services are exchanged within the political boundary of a country or in a domestic territory. When trade is held in between the domestic territory of a country, that is called domestic trade or internal trade. And when the trade between two countries or more than two countries held, that is called international trade. So international trade means exchange of goods and services within the rest of the world. International trade, by definition, it involves the exchange of goods or services between nations or countries. As we know that at present all the economies are open economies, all countries do international trade, all countries have no perfect resources to produce all goods and services. They can't satisfy their country people requirement or demand with the available resources in their country. So they have to do imports from rest of the world. And what type of commodity, if they produce more in quantity, they can sell or exports to the rest of the world. So international trade means exports and imports of goods and services. Now what is export? Export means the goods and services sold in foreign markets. And imports mean when we buy goods and services from rest of the world or from foreign country, that is called import. Export and import, the difference between this export and import is called net export. And net export may be positive or may be negative. Depends upon if the export value is more than the import value, then net export will be positive or favorable. And if import value is more than the export value, then net export will be negative or unfavorable. So international trade refers to the trade of goods and services between the two nations or countries. Next is, what is international trade? International trade defined by some economists and every economist explain this in different contexts. International trade theories are simply different theories to explain international trade. Trade is a concept of exchanging goods and services between the people. If goods and services are sold or purchased in a domestic territory, that is called internal trade or domestic trade. When we exchange goods and services between the two countries or two nations, that is called international trade. So it is clear from this definition that international trade is the concept of exchanging goods and services between people or entities in two different countries. Next is, what are the determinants of international trade, or why countries do international trade? There are so many determinants of international trade. First of all is the world price of goods. Some goods are available in foreign country at a cheaper price, and in our country that commodity may be available at higher price. In that case, international trade will be held. We will buy those goods or import those goods which are less in quantity in our country, and that commodity, if it is available at higher price, then we will import that commodity from the rest of the world. And if any commodity which is abundant in our country or which are produced in a large quantity, for example, agriculture. India is basically an agriculture based country. Here, agriculture is predominant sector, and more than 50% of the country people are engaged or employed in agriculture sector. So in India, agriculture is abundant, or agriculture products are available in a large quantity. So India can export agriculture products to the rest of the world at a cheaper price. And India can import industrial products or service sector things from rest of the world. As we know that India major importer of petroleum products, because in India here petroleum is only 25% for the satisfaction of country people's demand. Rest of the demand can be fulfilled by importing the petrol from petroleum exporting countries or OPEC. OPEC is Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. India mainly import petroleum from Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arab, Saudi Emirat, Kuwait, Libya, Venezuela, Nigeria, Algeria, etc. These are the OPEC countries where petrol is available by nature and at a very lower cost. Petrol is available in these countries. They are major exporter of petrol, and we are major importer of petroleum products. International trade helps us to take those goods and services which are rare or very scarce in our country, and we can export those goods which are in abundant quantity or in large quantity. So world price of goods determine the international trade. Second thing is the domestic price of goods also affects or determine the international trade. If domestic price of our good is higher, then our exports will fall and imports will be higher. Because if our domestic product price is higher, then foreign countries will not buy our product. And when they will not buy our product, then we can't export those goods to the rest of the world. In this case, our exports will fall and imports will rise. In this, net export will be negative, or balance of payment will become unfavorable. Third point is, if the world price is greater than the domestic price, then producer have the incentive to export the goods. On the other hand, if the world price is less than the domestic price, then consumer will import the goods from abroad. And the difference between world price and domestic price is the main cause of doing international trade. So the difference in the relative price of one good in terms of the other is equals or greater than comparative advantage. Countries mainly do international trade or engaged in international trade for gaining more advantages from international trade. International trade basically based on specialization or division of labor. The country who is specialized in the production of one commodity in large quantity, that country will export those goods and services to the rest of the world, and other things which we can't produce in larger quantity, or the cost of those goods which are very higher in our country, that commodity we will import from rest of the world. So international trade basically depends upon specialization. If, for example, India is specialized in agriculture products, so India will produce more agricultural goods and export to the rest of the world. Japan and US or Britain are specialized in industrial products, so they will produce more industrial goods and export to those goods to those countries who have less industrial products. For example, we will import industrial goods from Japan, Britain, or USA, and we can export agriculture products to the rest of the world or those nations who have less agriculture products. In this case, both countries will take advantage from the trade. And these advantages are the main reason behind doing international trade. So these are the determinants of international trade. The world price of goods determine the international trade level, same as domestic price also determine or affects our international trade of those goods and services which are dependent on domestic price. If domestic price is higher, our exports will fall, and if domestic price is lower, then exports will be higher. If world price is higher, then imports will be lower. If world price is lower, then exports or imports will be higher. So these are the determinants of international trade. And one of the main important factor is also this is that if there is abundant or God gifted or by nature provided at free of cost product is available in any country, that is the main advantage of doing international trade. For example, in some countries, petroleum products are available in abundant quantity, and in other countries, climate is suitable for agriculture products, and in other nations, for example, they are more specialized or more efficient to produce industrial products at a cheaper cost. All these are the determinants of international trade. Next is Gains from trade, because basically international trade depends upon the advantage or profits while doing international trade. First of all, we think about profit or gains, what we will gain after doing international trade. So, gains from international trade refers to the advantages which different countries participating in international trade enjoy as a result of specialization and division of labor. As we have discussed, that international trade basically depends upon specialization and division of labor. And while doing international trade, we must think about gains from trade. If we are gaining from doing international trade, then we will engage in this international trade process. Otherwise, if the cost of the production in our country and in rest of the world both are equal, then no one country will interested to do international trade. In this case, international trade will not be held and the gains from international trade will not exist. So the gains from trade are the benefits from trading rather than producing. For example, the benefits that accrue to each country to a transaction over and above the benefits each would have derived from producing the goods or services themselves. So, while doing international trade, the gains from trade or benefits from trading the goods and services with rest of the world is very important concept, because without gaining profit or without gaining benefits from international trade, the international trade will not exist. So if we are doing international trade, then we must think about what advantage, what profit we are taking from this international trade. So this is called gains from international trade. Next is, what are the advantages of international trade? As we have discussed that international trade, why countries involved in this international trade, basically the reason behind this is gains from trade. But not only gains from trade, we are doing exports and imports. So many reasons which related to international trade are also involved in this. One is economical aspect. First thing is comparative advantage. If any commodity we can produce at a lower price, then we will produce more those goods and export to the rest of the world. For example, China is the least cost producing country in the world. That's why China is exporting more and more goods to the rest of the world. If any country who can produce goods and services at a lower cost of production, that country will produce abundant quantity of that product and export those goods to the rest of the world, and taking advantage from this type of and least cost production. So comparative advantage is the main cause or main benefit while doing international trade. Second is lower cost. If a country is able or efficient to produce at a lower cost, then it will produce more and export those goods to the rest of the world. And if our cost of production is higher in our country, then we will better option to import those goods and services from rest of the world. In this case, we can take advantage from this international trade. Next is specialization. International trade basically depends upon specialization. Some countries are specialized in the production of industrial products. Some countries are specialized in the production of agriculture products. Those countries who have specialization in agriculture product, they will export agriculture products to the rest of the world. And those countries who are specialized in industrial products, they will produce more industrial product and export to the rest of the world. In this process, they will take advantage from the international trade. Specialization basically determine more experience and knowledge. If we have more experience and if we have more knowledge regarding any product or goods and services which we can produce in a larger quantity, then we can we have better option to specialize in that product and export to the rest of the world. Some countries are efficient or able to better use of their technologies. In that case, they will produce more goods and services, and in this case, they can export more and take advantage from the international trade. Next is, when we are specialized in the production of some goods, then we can take advantage from the increasing scale of production. If our country is producing goods and services in a larger quantity, then we will take some advantages like internal economies and external economies of scale of production. This topic we have discussed in law of production because returns to scale law, which is applicable in long run, explain that if any firm producing more and more goods in a long run, when all the factors of productions are variable, in that case, due to increase in production of goods and services, firm or industry will take some advantages or economies of scale like internal economies which occur in internal efforts and some external economies which is based on specialization and division of labor. In that case, the firm will produce more and exports these goods to the rest of the world. If we produce any commodity at a lower cost, that will be the benefit of our country. We will produce more and exports those goods to the rest of the world and take advantage from international trade. Technical factor is also main cause of international trade. For example, if we are more advanced, we use more advanced technologies or updated technologies in the production of goods and services, then we can produce in a larger quantity. If we have surplus product, we can export these goods to the rest of the world. And if we have deficient product or deficiency in the goods and services, then we can import these goods from rest of the world. So international trade helps us to take advantages from this trade, and during surplus time period, we can export those goods and services to the rest of the world and solve the problem of surplus production. And if we have deficient production or deficient output, then we can do imports from rest of the world and take advantages from international trade. So the problem of surplus production and deficient production or underproduction or overproduction problem can be sought out with the help of international trade. International trade enhance the competition in business. Because we know that if competition increases, consumer take advantage from that competition. If there is a competition exists in international trade, then higher quality or larger quantity of the goods and services will produce at a lower cost of production. And if the cost of production is lower, consumer will be able to buy those goods and services at a cheaper price. So that international trade give benefit to consumers and producers both in different aspects. So international trade is really a very good thing for country or rest of the world because international trade solve so many problems. These are the main advantages of international trade. Next is the theories of international trade, which is explained or introduced by some economists. For example, Adam Smith gave us absolute advantage theory of international trade. Adam Smith is called the father of economics, who first introduced economics and published his book Wealth of Nation in 1776. Adam Smith gave the concept of absolute advantage. And David Ricardo is the very famous economist who gave rent theory. According to David Ricardo, rent is the reward for using land only. And rent is only taken by land because land has some original and indestructible powers. Beside this rent theory, David Ricardo introduced comparative cost advantage theory also. So these are the two theories. One is absolute advantage theory of international trade, which is presented by Adam Smith, and second is comparative cost advantage theory, which is introduced by David Ricardo. We will explain these theories of absolute advantage and comparative advantage in international trade concept. What is absolute advantage theory? Absolute advantage or absolute cost advantage theory of international trade was presented by Adam Smith. The Wealth of Nation is the book name of Adam Smith. This theory explains that if one country is able to produce one commodity in larger quantity and other country is able to produce other commodity in larger quantity, then both countries will do international trade or exports those goods which they can produce more and imports those goods which they can produce less. In this case, both countries will take advantage or will gains from international trade. So absolute cost advantage theory based on natural and acquired resources. In this theory, we assume that labor is the main producing factor and we consider the cost of production basically which is based on labor cost. Labor theory of value explains the amount of labor required determines the cost of production or any type of goods and services. The principle of absolute cost advantage theory is beneficial when each country is a least cost producer of the one of the good being traded. So absolute cost advantage theory mainly tells us that if two countries are doing international trade, one is able to produce, for example, wheat, and other country is able to produce more in rice quantity, then both will do international trade, or both will do exports and imports of goods and services. And while doing this international trade, both will take advantages from international trade. It can be explained with the help of table and diagram. This is a table of absolute cost advantage theory of international trade. If we assume that two countries are doing international trade, one is India and other is China, and these two countries are producing two commodities, one is wheat and second is cloth. If India is producing wheat at a 20 units and China is producing wheat 8 units, India is producing cloth 6 units and China is producing cloth 14 units. Now it is clear from this table that India is able to produce more wheat and China is able to produce more units of cloth. In India, if we use per unit of labor, we can get the output of wheat 20 units and cloth output is 6 units. China is getting per unit of labor involving in the process of business, then wheat production will be 8 and the cloth production will be 14. In that case, India will export wheat to the China and China will import wheat from the India and export rice to the India. In this case, both countries will take advantage from the international trade. The first diagram here, two straight line demand curves are here. One is if India is producing, one is 6 and 20. India is producing 6 units of cloth and 20 units of wheat. If we take cloth on x-axis and wheat on y-axis, then India is producing 20 units of wheat and producing 6 units of cloth. And if we join 6 units to 20, we can get the line of India's production. And the other line representing the China's output of wheat and cloth. China is producing 8 units of wheat and 14 units of cloth. In this case, we can join 8 units of wheat to the 14 units of cloth. We can get another straight line which represents China's output per unit of labor. In this case, both countries will take advantage from this absolute cost difference in international trade. So this is the table and diagram of absolute cost advantage theory of international trade. Now next is theory of comparative advantage. This theory of comparative advantage was firstly proposed or propounded by Ricardo or David Ricardo. David Ricardo presented so many theories and so many principles regarding rent theory and regarding labor value theory and international trade theory also, in which comparative cost advantage theory was presented by David Ricardo. Under this theory, countries should specialize in producing those goods of which they are relatively more efficient producers. These countries should then produce or trade with the rest of the world to obtain needed commodities. If both countries are doing trade, and if one country is able to produce both goods in larger quantity, and the other country is not able to produce both goods in a larger quantity, in that case, both countries will engage in international trade. Both countries will do international trade and take advantages from doing this international trade. So theory of comparative advantage tells us that if two countries are doing international trade, two countries are producing two goods, and if one country is able to produce both goods in large quantity and other country is not able to produce both goods in large quantity, in that case both countries will do international trade and they will gain or they will take advantages from this international trade. In case of absolute cost advantage theory, we studied about that if one country is able to produce one commodity in large quantity and other country is able to produce other commodity in large quantity, but in case of comparative cost advantage theory, if one country is able to produce both the goods in larger quantity and other country is not able to produce both the goods in large quantity, in that case international trade will be held and both countries will take advantages from this international trade. Next is assumptions. What are the assumptions of international trade theory or comparative cost advantage theory? The theory of comparative cost advantage, which is presented by David Ricardo, in this theory, Ricardo assumed that there are only two countries involved in the international trade process and they produce only two goods, not more than two goods. Next is labor is the main producing factor of production. But we know that factors of production are four: land, labor, capital, and entrepreneur. But in this comparative cost advantage theory, we assume that labor is the only producing factor and the cost of production is measured in terms of labor units. And all the units of labor are homogeneous. It can't be possible. All units of labor can't be homogeneous. And they can't give you same quantity of output. But under this theory, we assume that all the units of labor are homogeneous or same. Next is production is subject to the law of constant return. It means this theory assumes that always constant return law is applicable. But we know that in the beginning, production always increases. And after that, production becomes maximum or constant, and at last it starts falling. But this theory assumes that always constant law of return is applicable in production function. Next assumption is factors of productions are perfectly mobile within the country, but immobile between the two countries. It means this assumption tells us that factors of production, which are basically four: land, labor, capital, and entrepreneur, all these factors of production are perfectly mobile or perfectly move or shift from one place to another place. And one from one nation to another nation, we can't shift these factors. Within the country, these factors can move, but between the countries, these factors are perfectly immobile. Immobile means which can't shift it, which can't shiftable or movable. So we assume that factors of production are perfectly mobile within the country. In our country, we can easily move, easily shift to each factor of production from one place to another place. But between the two countries, we can't move or we can't shift these factors of production. But we know that land can't be shifted within the country or between the countries. Then this assumption is unrealistic. But under this theory, These assumptions play very important role. Next assumption is full employment. There is full employment in countries. Full employment refers to the situation where all country people gets job opportunities. No one is unemployed at any prevailing wage rate. But according to Keynes, full employment does not exist in each and any country. Either it may be developed or it may be underdeveloped. Full employment is a rare situation, and at the level of full employment, 5 to 6% unemployment may be exist, which is called natural rate of unemployment, or voluntarily people may be unemployed at the level of full employment. So full employment is very rare situation and it can't be achieved very easily, but according to David Ricardo, in the theory of comparative cost advantage theory of trade, under this theory, Ricardo assumed that full employment exists in countries. So these are the assumptions of comparative cost advantage theory. One is that trade is held in between of two nations and both countries are producing only two goods and doing the trade of two goods. And the labor is the main producing factor of production. Rest of the factor we can't measure, but the units of production, unit of labor cost can be measured in terms of labor units. And all the units of labor are homogeneous. Production is subject to the law of constant return, not increasing return, not diminishing return. Always constant law of production is applicable. And the factors of productions are perfectly mobile within the country and immobile between the nations or countries. And there is a full employment exist in each and every country. All these assumptions are related to comparative cost advantage theory of international trade presented by David Ricardo. Next is Ricardo's comparative advantage can be explained with the help of this table. As I told you that in comparative cost advantage theory, one country is able to produce both the goods in larger quantity and other country is not able to produce both the goods in large quantity, but in this case trade will be held, and while doing international trade both countries will take advantage from this trade. Here we are taking two countries, one is England and second is Portugal. Next, two products here they are producing, one is cloth, other is wine. If England is able to produce cloth 100 units by using per unit of labor cost and wine 120 units by using per unit of labor cost, and Portugal produces cloth 90 units by using per unit of labor cost and wine 80 units at per unit of labor cost. So in this case, the table is showing that England is able to produce cloth and wine in a larger quantity and Portugal is not able to produce both goods in large quantity. Here we are seeing that Portugal is producing 90 and 80 units of wine and 90 units of cloth, but England is producing 100 units of cloth and wine is 120 units. So England has benefit in production of both the goods and Portugal has no advantage in both the goods. But in this case, England will specialize which commodity? England will be specialized in the production of wine, where England is producing wine 120 units, and which commodity Portugal is producing higher, that is cloth, 90 units. So in case of comparative cost advantage, England will produce more wine and export this wine to Portugal, and Portugal will produce more cloth and export to the England. In this case, international trade will be held and both countries will take advantage from this international trade. So both countries are better off trading with each other than existing in isolation. So this is the comparative cost advantage theory presented by Ricardo. Next is comparison. Now, what is the comparison? As we have discussed with you, that absolute cost advantage theory tells us that if one country is able to produce one thing in a more quantity and other country is able to produce other commodity in a larger quantity, then both countries will do international trade, and while doing this international trade, they will take advantage from this trade. And comparative cost advantage theory tells us the situation where one country has a lower opportunity cost, relative cost in the production of a good than other country. And in absolute advantage, where ability of a country to produce a good using fewer resources than another country. This is the basic difference between absolute cost advantage and comparative cost advantage. And in these two cases, international trade will be held, and the international trade will give benefit to both the nations while doing trade. Next is free trade versus protectionism. What is free trade and what is protective trade? Free trade, from its name, when there is no restriction, when there is no barriers while doing trade between the nations, that is called free trade. Free trade means exchange of goods and services between the nations without any restrictions, barriers imposed by the government. Free trade, according to the theory of comparative advantage and absolute cost advantage, leads to an efficient global allocation of resources and maximization of global output, with all countries sharing the benefit of trade. But protective trade is that trade where some restrictions and some barriers imposed by the government while doing international trade. But we need to consider the type of barriers to free trade and what are the reasons for imposing these barriers in international trade. So free trade means the trade between the nations without any restriction, without any barriers imposed by the government. And what is protective trade? Protective trade is that trade in which government puts some restrictions and barriers while doing international trade. Next is, what is the difference between free trade and protectionism, and why free trade is better or protectionism is better for the nation? First is, free trade protects job, but protectionism protects domestic jobs. Next is, free trade allow us for increasing specialization, but protectionism provides protection to the infant industries or especially strategic industries. Its strength, absolute free trade strengthens absolute and comparative cost advantage, but protectionism allow free movement of resources. Free trade strengthens political interest, but protectionism adds cost to the consumers. Free trade provides access to more markets, but protectionism protects national culture and national domestic industries, domestic employees. All things can be protected with the help of protectionism policy. Free trade prevents dumping. What is dumping? Dumping is a situation when producers sell more goods at a lower cost at a very cheaper rate to the rest of the world and charge higher price from the domestic market. When producers sell goods and services in a world market at a lower rate and in a domestic market at a higher rate, that is called dumping. It hurts the domestic consumers of the nation. So free trade prevents dumping and protectionism increases international competition and efficiency. Free trade also fosters efficient market mechanism. So this is the free trade or protectionism. Why we need free trade? Free trade is very useful while doing international trade because in this case there is no barriers, no restriction while doing trade. But protectionism is also very necessary because if we want to protect our domestic producers, our domestic industries from the competition of the rest of the world or other big entrepreneurs, then we must have to give protection to our industries. So protectionism is very good while doing international trade between the nations because with the help of this protectionism, the flow of smuggling or drugs or harmful products will stop. But while doing free trade, there is no restriction. Doing in between of two nations, if we are doing trade, then there is no restriction. Either we are doing harmful goods trade or smuggling, or we are doing drugs product trade. In this case, it will give harm to the nation. So free trade increases monopoly power. Free trade increases the development of those nations who are already well developed. Free trade give advantages to only developed countries, not underdeveloped countries. But protectionism give benefit to underdeveloped countries. That's why both free trade and protectionism both are good at some ground, but not always. Next is what are the methods of protection or what types of method we can use in protectionism. There are two methods or two restrictions we can use while doing international trade. One is tariff barrier, second is non-tariff barrier. These tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers are the two methods of protectionism. Tariff is import duty. Tariff duty is an import tax which is imposed on the inflow of foreign goods and to the domestic market according to Geoffrey E. Wood 1988. Tariff duties imposition is solely taking place for two main reasons: to increase the revenue to the state and to protect the local firms against foreign competition. So tariff barriers or tariff duty, if we use this tariff duty, we can restrict imports, we can control imports, and we can protect our local firms or industries against foreign competition. And what are the non-tariff barriers? Non-tariff barrier is another method of protectionism. Non-tariff barrier, on the other hand, is a non-tax measure to favor the domestic firms against the foreign suppliers. It is a complicated concept because it differs to different states, depends on the internal state policies. Under non-tariff barrier, we include import quota. If government puts some restrictions while doing imports, like import quota, so import quota means the quantity of import which we can import the goods and services from rest of the world. If government puts some restrictions that this much quantity you can import, not too much. So this will also decrease imports and increase our exports, and our domestic producers will always protect by this method. So tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers, these are the two methods of protection. Next is non-tariff trade barriers. There are two methods which is available or provided by the government or community to capture area, see, from foreign producers under quota. Non-tariff barrier, under this under this method of protectionism, we use import quota. The domestic government would auction quotas or fix the import quota to importers in a free market. The limited quota supply would go to those importers most in need of the product who would pay the higher price. So convert the quota into an equivalent tariff. This is the non-tariff trade barrier in which government fix the quantity of the or limit of the import. And tariff barrier is a import tax or import duty which is imposed by the government to restrict the import from rest of the world. These are the two methods of protectionism, tariff and non-tariff. Now next concept is terms of trade. What is terms of trade? Terms of trade is the ratio between average export prices and average import prices. The formula of the calculation of terms of trade is price of export divided by price of imports into 100. Next is international trade. Terms of trade gives us the formula of this terms of trade can be calculated by using this formula. The price of export divided by import price. If the price of export is higher, then terms of trade will be favorable. If the price of import will be higher, then terms of trade will be unfavorable. Next is WTO. What is WTO? WTO is a World Trade Organization and officially commenced on 1st January 1995. But before that, WTO, it was GATT. GATT is General Agreement on Trade and Tariff, which commenced in 1948. At present, more than 150 countries are the member countries of WTO. And WTO is an organization which fixes the restrictions or rules and regulations while doing international trade. The organization is attempting to complete negotiation on the Doha Development Round, which was launched in 2001 with an explicit focus on addressing the needs of developing countries. Next, the conclusion of WTO has failed to live up to its promises over the past decades because WTO always favor those nations who are well developed like USA, because WTO is made by USA and WTO always puts some restrictions on underdeveloped countries and give advantages to developed nations. In this case, the difference or gap between developed and underdeveloped country widens, and WTO is the main principle of WTO is not bias, but practically WTO bias the nations, and WTO favors some nations and put some restrictions to other underdeveloped nations. Next, the conclusion of this topic is today we have done international trade. International trade is very necessary for the development of our country, and international trade contribute significantly in the development process. Some economists believe that international trade and the functioning of the present international economic system benefited developed nations at the expenses of developing nations. Thank you.